Hey you and welcome folks, my name is Mike and thank you so much for joining me on a Keith-less episode of the That Chapter podcast. You know what, I called Keith and I said, here listen, trusted associate, dear Keith, why don't you hop on this old episode of the podcast? And he said no. He said he was too mad at people because they were making fun of the fact that he wears the same black t-shirt in every single episode. You guys don't even see him wearing it. This is a podcast. But he just said he was being bullied by the audience and he just couldn't take it anymore. So he said he was going to give this one a miss or something like that. I mean, I'm literally putting words in his mouth. But, he probably would have said something like that if we had recorded this episode together. But, we're just not. I mean, okay, it could also be the fact that I'm going on vacation and we didn't have time to meet up before I left and I had to record an episode of the podcast for you guys. But it could just as easily have been because he felt like he was being bullied because, in fairness now, I mean, he's Keith. We should all bully him. But no, Keith's great and he will be back on the next episode of the podcast. But for you today, it's a Mike solo and I have for you the story of Jeannettes Disappearance and the Devil's Teeth. For this story, we're going all the way back to August 7th, 1972, in the suburbs of New Jersey for a good old dose of the famous Mike's dearly beloved Satanic Panic. I mean, when you have any episode of the podcast with the word satanic in it, I'm in. I gotta be in there. This is a story of a young teen who went missing. When she was finally found, it was in the most disturbing way possible, which leaves us with so many questions that come up to today. See, on one afternoon, 16-year-old Jeanette DePalma left her home at 4 Clearview Road in Springfield Township, having planned on stopping by a friend's house before heading into work for her afternoon shift. Jeanette would never arrive at her friend's place, nor would she make it to work. When she didn't return home that evening, as expected, her parents, Salvatore and Florence, called 911 and reported their daughter missing. That was late summer 1972. The answers would come in the fall. With 4 sisters and 3 brothers, Jeanette was the 8th and youngest of the DePalma children. She was born August 3rd, 1956. That meant she'd only turned 16 years old 4 days before her disappearance on August 7th, 1972. The DePalma family moved to the upper middle-class suburb of Springfield Township in the mid-1960s. Springfield Township is basically a suburb of Newark, and for that, my only frame of reference is The Sopranos. So there you go. They'd previously just lived 30 minutes away in Roselle, New Jersey, so it wasn't a huge change for the family. Being a large Italian family, the DePalmas slotted into the community quite comfortably. They later described themselves as born-again evangelical Christians and attended the Assemblies of God Evangelical Church in Elizabeth, New Jersey. They did that several times a week, but didn't make them stand out too much. The move away from the traditional church wasn't exactly looked on favorably by the neighbors, and while they weren't persecuted, they were ostracized to some degree. In fact, as a somewhat general rule, the families kept to themselves and didn't go out of their way to socialize, but it's not like they had any specific issues with anyone. The DePalma family were just pretty reserved. Jeanette, though, was a little different to her siblings and parents, being much more outgoing, and even though she was known to be religious, even for her young age, she still knew how to cut loose and have a good time. Jeanette's parents, Salvatore and Florence DePalma, were, pretty interesting. Sal, he worked auto mechanic, Flo, a homemaker, and they were happy to have moved to this area. It was safe and quiet in comparison to the surrounding towns. Now, the family being very private was sort of odd to the neighbors. This was Italiano neighborhood where everybody just knows each other's meatballs, and having dinner together, knowing the neighbors well, almost sort of mandatory. So the DePalmas were actually viewed as a little odd, a little off by those around them, but they let them be. Rumors did go around town, though, about the family, likely sparked by the numerous times police had to be called to the home. Seems like they were collecting, domestic disputes like there was Pokemon cards in the DePalma home. And it wasn't necessarily Sal doing the hitting either, though Sal wasn't, allegedly, very nice to Flo. It was a busy household, that's for sure. Now, Jeanette DePalma had a fun-loving vibe that actually got her into trouble and earned her a reputation as being somewhat promiscuous, a reputation that was completely inaccurate and unfounded. Basically, she was growing up in this ultra-conservative area and dared to have fun, which included kissing a boy or two, and the local gossips and bitching that did the rest. Sadly, the gossip persisted even after her tragic death. It was on August 7th, 1972, however, that the story begins, and things got pretty dark. That morning, Sal and Flo sat Jeannette down and told her something they knew would upset her, and it was sort of like a kind of an odd thing. Her cousin, Lisa, had run away about a month ago, ran away from home, and hadn't been found since. Now, Lisa and Jeannette were as close as cousins could be, so Jeannette was pretty upset about this, and even more upset that it took her parents a month to tell her that her close cousin had run away from home. Now, the reason her parents had waited so long to tell her that Lisa had run away was that she had run away before, and they didn't want to wind up their daughter Jeannette for no reason if she would come back. But she hadn't come back, so now they had reason. Jeannette was not in a good mood the morning of August 7th. On the day of her disappearance, Jeannette called her friend, Gail Donahue, at around 11 a.m. regarding their plans for the day. The two were to hang out at Gail's house in Berkeley Heights, which is about 7-ish miles away from Jeannette's home. Jeannette told her parents she had an evening shift that day at a part-time job. She said she was to walk to the train station in Summit, which is about 3 miles from her home, then take the train over to Gail's before heading back to start her shift. In reality, she was going to hitchhike. And I think even Jeannette's parents would have had an issue with that if they had known, but they didn't know. She left her home at around 1:20 p.m. according to her parents, but she never made it to either her friend's house or work. And it was that night, well after she was due to return home, that Sal and Flo began to worry. Like, a lot. She was never late, and even if she was, she would call. They began to ring around to friends and neighbors asking if anyone had seen her, to zilch affirmatives. And then they called the Springfield Township Police. The DePalma family were duly informed, because this was the 70s of course, that they would have to wait 24 hours before anything could be done. The search did begin after that, but honestly, from the very start, it went nowhere. There was no sightings of her. The last sighting of Jeannette was a neighbor, seeing her just calmly stroll down the road looking for a lift. But the police going round and round and round, simply no sign of her whatsoever. It was like she had just vanished off the face of the earth. There was zero leads. It's like, I can't even overstate like how little they had to go on other than the neighbor seen her walk down the path, and then she just vanished. It would be 6 weeks after she disappeared that Jeannette's fate would be discovered in possibly the worst way. On September 19th, 1972, not far from the DePalma's home, a woman was busily unpacking her new-bought groceries when her pooch trotted off into the woods, returning a few minutes later with what, at first, the owner thought was a large muddy stick. Only when the good boy dropped the stick at her feet, she realized what she was actually seeing was a bone. Specifically, it was a human forearm. The right arm complete with decomposing flesh and white polished fingernails at the end of the hand. Yeah, damn. I honestly don't know how anyone could get that horror show out of their mind. I mean, at first, they obviously thought this was a joke. This is like, mid-September, you're into autumn and fall now, you're thinking maybe it's a Halloween decoration. Somebody was getting these things up ready a little early, but no, it was real. And that grim discovery of the severed arm led to an immediate and intensive grid search. The search hadn't even gone to full swing though, when, later that day, a volunteer called officers to check out what could be possibly a body on the top of a cliff in Springfield's Hoodale Quarry. The search was called off as quickly as it began when responding officers located the source of the forearm. The place where the body was found had a nickname among local residents, the Devil's Teeth. That name may have inspired theories about how the body came to be there, but we'll get to that. As soon as the body was found, investigators working the DePalma case had an inkling that this could be Jeannette. Their instincts proved correct, and the remains were quickly identified as the missing teenager. Jeannette's body was laying face down on the edge of the cliff, pretty much like right beside it. She was found fully clothed with flip-flops beside her. Laying nearby was a woman's pocketbook, her pocketbook, but it didn't have any clues as to, what could have happened when Jeannette walked out her home that day. And unfortunately, because Jeannette's remains had been exposed to the elements for so long, they were severely decomposed by the time they were recovered. Basically, anything outside of the clothing had been eaten away by animals. Let me read you out a quote here, folks, from Death on the Devil's Teeth, from the officer who found her. Quote, "The body was lying face down on a flat area on top of this hill. I'd say that this area was maybe 20 feet around. The body was clad in a blue t-shirt and tan slacks. I immediately remembered that this was the description of the clothing that Jeanette DePalma was wearing on the day she went missing. The body had no shoes or socks on. There were flip-flops, but they weren't on the feet. They were lying by the body. Animals had eaten most of the flesh off of her feet and all around her head." Now, all of that meant a full autopsy would be impossible. The coroner, Chief Medical Examiner Bernard Ehrenberg, was only able to record Jeanette's death as suspicious and not specifically a homicide. He did note that most likely the cause of her death was either strangulation or asphyxiation due to there being no broken bones or damage that could be attributed to a knife or a gunshot wound. Still though, that didn't stop the rumor mill from spinning a narrative of a drug-fueled orgy that ultimately led to her death. And though there were no signs of sexual assault, that couldn't be ruled out entirely either. Incredibly tragic discovery for her parents who had been searching for their youngest girl for 6 weeks, and then she was found in a very odd place, a nearby quarry, in very odd ways, and the fact that she was found on a place called the Devil's Teeth, I mean, immediately it sends a shiver down your spine. And the exact circumstances of how Jeanette's remains were discovered, and the scene around them has become a central part of the wider, and creepier, mystery. According to some early newspaper reports, Jeanette's body was found surrounded by branches and sticks that formed the shape of a coffin. There were also dozens of makeshift crosses made out of smaller sticks and twigs, dotted all around the scene. Witchcraft was the word that was used. There was also wooden crosses over her head that were made out of 2 sticks, and also some stones arranged around the top of her head in the shape of a semicircle. By the time the reports had made themselves around the country, by way of usual gossip and game of telephone, these arranged branches had become a full-on pentagram, and the crosses had somehow become the brutalized remains of small animals. I mean, talk about escalation. The story quickly kind of got out of control. The very first news report into her death went something like, well, it went exactly like this. Let me read it out. Quote, "Investigation into the death of 16-year-old Jeanette DePalma is focusing on elements of black witchcraft and Satan worship. A review of death scene photos, according to reports, is leading authorities to believe the girl's death may have been in the nature of a sacrifice. Pieces of wood, at first thought to be at the scene by chance, are now seen as symbols. Detectives throughout Union County have been alerted to the possibility that a cult or a cult member played a part in the death. A search party discovered her remains. She had been missing 6 weeks on September 19th in a wooded area of the Hoodale Quarry atop a 40-foot cliff about 400 yards from Shunpike Road. One search said 2 pieces of wood were crossed on the ground over her head. More wood framed the body like a coffin. Another person who was there said, 'I guess if you guys are looking for signs, they were there.' And so the investigation began. And an immediate name linked to the Jeanette DePalma case was, dun 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 folks, you might remember this one, John List, who we covered, you might remember him. We covered him like about a month ago or something on this very podcast. John List, also of New Jersey, not far away, had murdered his family about a year before. He had vanished after the murder. I mean, we know, you guys know, me and Keith discussed it, what actually happened to John List. But after murdering his family in a sort of witchcrafty, satanic way, I mean, it wasn't really, but in this big old mansion, the bodies were discovered all shot in the head, creepy music was playing throughout the mansion, and his daughter was allegedly very interested in witchcraft. People are reading about these reports about John List in the news. He disappears. Had he returned to New Jersey? Had he killed Jeanette DePalma too? Because if you'll recall from the John List episode, people still believed he could be in the area. Remember, his mansion burnt down like a couple of weeks after he disappeared. That was attributed to John List at the time. So, that quickly became attached to the DePalma case. And this is a lot of weird, strange murders happening in this area of New Jersey around the same time. Or was it the Jersey Devil? Was it some other? I mean, we're entering the period of hippies, satanic panic, all that sort of business. So who was it? Well, that was the thing. The case of who killed Jeanette DePalma, if she was indeed killed, it went cold almost immediately. like ice cold. I mean, there was no clues as to how she died, right? She'd been up here for so long, but it's like she died somehow. So either somebody killed her, which is what everybody's thinking, some satanic cult member, vampire, witch, Satanist killed her, dumped her body here in a place with the name of Satan himself. Or there's, I suppose, also the small possibility that she was hit by a car, she died, hit and run perhaps, and they dumped her body up here, not wanting to get caught. Maybe it was an accident and they just didn't want to get arrested. Who knows? But that was the thing. The facts of Jeanette's case would almost be completely forgotten outside of her family, and decades were allowed to pass before anyone would take another serious look at her case. And surprisingly, it would be a pair of true crime journalists, rather than trained detectives, that would raise the most likely suspect in the mystery of what happened to Jeanette DePalma. Jesse P. Pollock and Mark Moran looked hard into this case, in the end spending more than a decade looking into Jeanette's death before publishing a book on the case, which I already read out a segment from, Death on the Devil's Teeth, and that was released in 2015. Pollock and Moran had been looking into the case for the website Weird New Jersey in the dying days of the last millennium, and then they just became consumed by it. This was of course back before a Google search could turn up 100 contemporary newspaper articles on even the most obscure of mysteries. All the pair had to go on, back then, were the rumors and rumblings of a wild party girl that got murdered by Satanists in the 1970s. After a lot of back and forth with the Springfield Police Department, which included the police telling them that Jeanette's case file had been destroyed, if you can believe that, during floods caused by a hurricane, the two authors, Pollock and Moran, were eventually able to uncover crime scene photographs of Jeanette's body. Now, the pictures were taken before anything had been moved, and clearly showed that there was no coffin formed by branches. There was certainly no pentagram at the crime scene, and there was no sacrificed animals hanging from trees. These were rumors that had grown up over 20-30 odd years. There were several branches around her body that had likely fallen after being shaken loose in the bad weather, and that could have formed what could be generously described as some form of geometric shape. If, you squint real hard. For example, two detectives who were at the scene, even back in the 70s, they were scratching their head at the time of the witchcraft reports. They didn't see anything like what the responding officer had seen. The cross, the semicircle of halo rocks, nothing. They did see two trees that had died and were leaning on each other in what could have looked like a cross, but it really just looked like two trees that just happened to fall and were leaning on each other. Back in the 70s, though, word of Jeanette's death, however inaccurate it was, had spread around town like wildfire. There was no way an already religious and conservative small town in the United States was going to miss out on such an easy opportunity for some good old moral panic and community outrage. The tall tales about what actually happened, really the scene of Jeanette DePalma's death, that seems to have what really lit the fire about Jeanette's death being witchcrafty and satanic. That all stemmed from an interview by Jeanette's pastor, Reverend James Tate, an interview he gave to a local Springfield newspaper. It was in his interview that first raised his theory that Jeanette had been captured by Satanists and used in a ritual sacrifice. I mean, it's not hard to see past the pastor's own agenda, or at least, it shouldn't have been. See, the thing about Jeanette is she was framed often in two different ways. One, it depends on what your agenda is. One, she was a good religious girl, murdered for her faith, kind of a martyr, if you will. Other times she was framed as this wild, promiscuous teen who, got what she deserved, being murdered by Satanists. And it's like, really? Let me read out this is from an article I found on newspaper.com, right? This is October 7th, 1972, so, a couple of weeks after Jeanette's body had been found, and this is the interview the pastor gave with the local paper. Quote, "The pastor of the church that Jeanette DePalma attended said yesterday, the 16-year-old Springfield girl may have been captured by Satanists and then killed when she tried to lecture the group on Jesus Christ." When he says may have been, by the way, you may as well fill in, she may as well have been an astronaut, because it has the same legitimacy. He was pulling this out of his ass. Quote, "It's just a personal theory," said Reverend James Tate of the Assemblies of God Church in Elizabeth, "but knowing Jeanette, it's possible. She was extremely religious and a very devout parishioner," the clergyman said. "She may have been picked up by someone, or by a group. He theorized that they took her to a devil worship rite, but she probably tried to lecture in some way. She was so religious that she would often talk to friends and acquaintances about God. He believed that when she tried to lecture them about Jesus, their fanaticism arose and they killed her. Reverend Tate said the DePalma girl was a perfect target for the hate of Satanists. Her super religious attitude was scorned by this type of people, he said. Witchcraft had become very popular recently because organized religion cannot hold its people. Young people, especially, have fallen away from the church. Jeannette may have been a symbol of Christ to these devil worshippers, and that's why they killed her. Reverend Tate said yesterday that a detective on the Springfield police force told him a person, reported to be a witch, had been brought to the scene in the quarry to look at crossed sticks that surround the body. Springfield Police Chief George Parcell said, "I heard some people brought a witch over there, but I know nothing about it." The prosecutor's office has consistently refused to comment officially on the possibility of witchcraft and Satanism in the girl's death. End quote. So yeah, basically a priest looking for attention did a lot of heavy lifting in this case, and I love the way the priest says, "Oh, they brought a witch over there to confirm, that this was witchcraft. A detective told me so." And then literally the police chief says, "No, that didn't happen." I mean, you have a teen girl murdered on a place called the Devil's Teeth, of all places. You got alleged wooden crosses and other strange items around there, and there, spark to kindling, everything just went wild from there. As the years passed, then, outlandish stories of witchcraft and human sacrifice filled the vacuum where legitimate evidence should have been gathered. The usual suspects were dragged in front of the court of public opinion. Heavy metal and drugs were blamed, despite Jeannette being far from a metalhead, and as far as drugs go, puff on a joint or two was as far as she ever went. According to her parents, she was far more likely to be found giving her friends a literal come-to-Jesus chat than she could be found headbanging and doing some empirical research into the effects of chemicals on teenagers' coolness. While her parents may have painted a bit of an idealized image of their daughter, she certainly wasn't the teenage tearaway she was made out to be by some other people. Her friends and those who knew her best, they all described her as being a perfectly normal teenager. She liked rock music, boys, and all the things typical of hormonal teens. Still, the facts rarely matter when it comes to a good old neighborhood scandal, and over the years, Jeannette's death had almost passed completely into urban myth. When people outside the DePalma family talked about Jeannette, you were far more likely to hear some fictional character conjured up by locals to make themselves feel safer. Usually it would default to a promiscuous teen who partied too hard and had gotten got, by some malevolent evil stalking the woods. As long as that description didn't apply to you, you'd be safe, sure wouldn't you? You'd be far less likely to hear about their reality, which seems to be a sweet girl who was loved by her family, friends, and was dedicated to her faith, because, after all, if it could happen, to some innocent sweet girl like Jeannette, maybe it could happen to you too. Now, that was it though. It was a story of there's two versions of Jeannette. The real version of Jeannette, who was religious and then made out by the priest to be super religious, or the other version, which was a promiscuous girl. Both of these characters eventually becoming fictional characters, meeting their end via Satanism on the rocks. But what actually happened to Jeannette DePalma? That was the real question, and a question we still have. Now, that's not to say there's never been any legitimate suspects or theories. One early lead involved a local homeless man only known by the nickname Red. He was first brought up as a possible suspect by an anonymous tip, and police thought he was at least worth talking to. He was known to camp in the woods not far from the Devil's Teeth, and when detectives went to question him, he'd seemingly done a legger from his usual camp. That only made authorities more eager to have a word with him. But a few weeks into the investigation, Red was ruled out as a suspect. The specifics were never shared with the public, but the Union County Prosecutor's Office made it very clear they were not pursuing the lead any further. The truth about Jeannette's last few hours are much more mundane as well than the legend would have you believe, really. I mean, partying with Satanists? No. All we know is that she walked away, last seen walking down the road. According to some sources, after leaving home, Jeannette made the decision to pop into Donna Bladis' house, who was a friend of Jeannette's. I guess this would have been on her way, and the distance was only about 1 mile from Jeannette's home. Apparently, there were people always hanging out at this residence, like, not having a full-on party per se, but just hanging out, shooting the shit. And the question was raised, could there have been drugs involved at this place? Now, Jeannette wasn't unfamiliar with drugs. She had used some before the family turned evangelist, and this was according to her own mother. So could it be that the conversation she had with her parents on the morning of her disappearance upset her so much that she decided to use drugs in hope of numbing the pain? Well, who knows? But there were some rumors circling about the Bladis' involvement in this case. Not only did the DePalma family believe the Bladis' had something to do with Jeannette's death, but also some people in the police department did. You see, according to the rumors, some people believed that after attending the Bladis' home, Jeannette overdosed on some kind of drug there, and people simply panicked, moving her body to the Devil's Teeth in hopes of covering up what would have been a tragic accident. See, according to a police sketch made of the scene where Jeannette was found, there was a, quote, clear vial with unknown substance found. The contents of this vial were never tested though, never tested for drugs, which is interesting. I mean, could that vial have been left behind on purpose by the people that carried Jeannette's body up to the Devil's Teeth in hope that the police will find that vial, test it for drugs, and then figure out how exactly Jeannette died from an overdose? But if this was the case, then why were the contents of her purse scattered around about 8 to 9 feet away from her body, the purse itself missing, as well as her wallet and money gone, and of course, her necklace, which we know she always wore? Why were they missing from the scene if it was an accident? Well, could that be just so simple, an explanation that after the body was placed at the Devil's Teeth, Red, the homeless man that the police were searching for at one point, maybe this homeless guy, he stumbled upon Jeannette's body, and he was the one to empty out her purse, taking some of the items that the police never found. As for why he didn't report his findings, according to this theory, well, that's obvious. I mean, I believe that if that's what happened, he would have just been simply scared of being found guilty of the murder of Jeannette's death, and the police were looking for him regardless, due to some believed involvement with what happened. Now, he was cleared, but it was interesting. Now, of course, this is all speculation, and unfortunately, as the case stands, we might never know what actually happened to Jeanette DePalma. But that didn't stop the family from trying to find it out, Salvatore and Florence even hired their own private investigator in the early 80s, specifically because the police weren't able to find out themselves. Their private investigator was himself unable to make any progress in an investigation into Jeanette DePalma's death, murder, whatever it was. 2021, however, would turn out to be a pivotal year for the case, even raising the prospect of the first genuine suspect, if she was murdered, in decades. There were several letters written to one of the authors of Death on the Devil's Teeth, and they were from a convicted serial killer, Richard Cottingham, aka the Torso Killer. Cottingham left several hints that pointed to him being the one who killed Jeannette. Now, all Richard Cottingham will most certainly be getting his own full-ass episode in the near future, but for now, suffice to say, he murdered approximately 20 people from the late 60s to the early 80s, all in New York and New Jersey. I mean, he's also named the Torso Killer or Times Square Ripper, so there you go, and well, he wasn't given those names for no reason whatsoever. He was known to torture his victims for sometimes days at a time. Really horrific stuff. And he says himself he's killed over 100 women. And he did always focus on vulnerable people. Hitchhikers for sure. And what do we know Jeanette DePalma was last likely doing? That exact thing. One of his first victims was in 1969, only 3 years before Jeannette, in the town of Little Ferry, New Jersey, which is about 25 miles from Springfield, New Jersey. When Jeannette vanished in 1972, he was in New Jersey himself, not far away, and later, around that same time, 2 other girls hitchhiking would become victims of his. So, after spotting her hitchhiking, Jeannette hitchhiking, had Richard Cottingham been the one who had picked her up? Had he kidnapped and murdered her? It's very, very possible. Adding further merit to the serial killer option is the fact that Jeanette's favorite necklace, a plain gold cross and chain, she wore it every day, it was never recovered. It was never found on her body. Is it sitting in some psychopath's trophy box today? Now, one of the authors of Death on the Devil's Teeth, Pollock, he believed Richard Cottingham could have been responsible for DePalma's murder, and he managed to actually persuade him to agree to a meeting with the Union County Prosecutor's Office. In 2014, Cottingham had apparently already confessed to killing 3 girls in the New Jersey area, sometime between 1968 and 1969, But even though he murdered hitchhikers and girls around DePalma's age, around the same time in this area, his MO though was much more violent than what happened to Jeanette. And because of that, he wasn't considered a suspect. But I mean, he killed so many people, I think that he shouldn't be dismissed quite so easily just because her death, from what we know, wasn't considered especially violent. It's hard to find really much more on any connection between Richard Cottingham and Jeanette DePalma, but it's surely worth looking into. And as I said, folks, hold on to your horses because we will definitely be doing a full episode about Richard Cottingham on this very podcast at a later date. Another witness would come forward, a 19-year-old woman named Robin, who would say that on the night in question, August 7th, 1972, at around 10:30, 11 p.m., she was driving home to Berkeley Heights, which is where Jeanette was planning on going, when she saw a small, young, dark-haired girl hitchhiking on the corner of the street. This Robin, she pulled over, asked, "Why were you hitchhiking so late?" It was pretty late in the evening, and asked where she was going, and this girl allegedly said she was going to Berkeley Heights to meet some friends. Now, Robin was heading in that same direction, so she let her in, but was only going to take this girl as far as her own apartment. The girl said that was fine, because she was meeting some friends just a block away. And in this car, during this journey, the girl was allegedly very quiet, fidgeting with a necklace and her pocketbook strap. This is what Robin said, acting just very anxious and sort of on edge. The girl then got out of the car on the side of the road, and Robin, the driver, said she saw her walking towards a small group of young people just up ahead. Then later on, when Robin heard about Jeanette DePalma's body being found, it matched the description of the hitchhiker she picked up. When she came forward saying she believed she saw Jeanette that night, she said the girl was wearing dungarees, a light-colored top, and sandals, which is exactly what DePalma was wearing when she disappeared. But the police also said that this encounter, Robin's encounter, happened around 8:30 p.m. Even though Robin was full sure it was much later in the day because it was fully dark out, Robin was surprised to see a young girl hitchhiking this late in the evening. So it's weird that the police were like, no, you're wrong, we're right, it happened earlier. It was very, very strange. But if that's what happened, it sort of changes the timeline of what happened to Jeanette, like by a lot. There's a whole 8, 9, 10 hours when we really have no idea what Jeanette was doing. And it kind of lends more credence to something going wrong with friends, maybe a drugs overdose, whatever. The thing was, Jeanette was planning to go meet friends in Berkeley Heights, but those friends she was going to meet said she never arrived. So who were the friends Robin saw her meeting in Berkeley Heights? Because it's not the friends, she was supposed to be going to meet. Chalk it up to another mystery in this already unhinged case with 1,000 mysteries in it. The witchcraft angle, it's baloney. I mean, maybe there was something odd around her body. Maybe someone said it was weird. But nothing conclusive towards the whole witchcraft angle has ever been proven. And as I said, a lot of this came from the first officer on the scene. I mean, who knows what he saw, but other detectives who turned up later were scratching their head when they listened to what he was saying. Jeanette DePalma was out there for weeks. Maybe the wind and the elements, they moved branches around her body in such a way. It seems that the satanic angle just grew and grew and grew over time, not helped by one priest who loved the sound of his own voice. To this day, Jeanette's death is still classified as suspicious rather than a homicide. That means it can't and won't likely be investigated as a murder. I mean, again, we don't know how she died, but the fact that her gold necklace is missing means somebody else likely took that. Her family, friends, and others with an interest in the case have appealed hundreds of times over the years for that verdict to be changed and more resources being made available. But for whatever the reason might be, any requests have been consistently denied. Now, that is not to say there hasn't been any hope out there to finally figure out what happened to Jeanette. Thanks to the people involved with Justice for Jeanette, there is still constant rallying to change her case into a homicide case and finally have DNA tests done that have never been done before, all in hope to find out the truth behind her death and finally give her family and friends the peace they so well deserve. If you want to help out regarding this case, go to justiceforjeannette.com and see what you can do to solve the case. It's an interesting case. Who really knows what happened to Jeanette DePalma? Maybe it was a hit and run and an accident, and then you have this whole urban legend that sprung up after years and years and years until finally a book was written about it, disproving all those urban legends. But regardless, it is a very creepy story. And there you have it, folks. That will do it for this whole episode of the That Chapter podcast, Jeanette DePalma and the Devil's Teeth. I hope you enjoyed this whole one. Keith will be back for, of course, and I think this episode will be a little bit shorter, but it'll tide you over. But we'll be back with a fresh one next week, so stay tuned. Stay tuned, folks. Stay tuned. All right, folks, thank you so much for listening. As always, rate, review, all that good stuff. Or else. All right, folks, thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, love ya. Bye.